Welcome everybody back for our second panel. Again, really grateful to the Secretary General and Ambassador Silverberg for their very thorough conversation, hitting on so many of the topics that we'll be addressing later throughout this conference. I'm very excited about our next panel for several reasons. As many of you know, we launched a trade and environment series in 2020, and we plan to continue that discussion this year. Addressing climate change is a top policy goal for the Biden administration, and we plan to address various aspects of this issue from a trade perspective in the year to come. Before I introduce the panel, however, I want to continue to call out some of the names of people you are in community with at today's conference, even if you can't see them. So welcome today to Adam Owens with General Motors, one of our conference benefactors, Vanessa Ciara with the American Clean Power Association, Alex Perkins with Melman, Castagnetti, Rosen, and Thomas, and Mary Latimer with Mondelez International. Welcome, Adam, Vanessa, Alex, and Mary, and welcome to all of our panelists who are coming to us from around the world. From Geneva, we'd like to welcome Ambassador Gloria Abraham Peralta, Costa Rica's permanent representative to the WTO and co-chair of the WTO's Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, and Aik Ho Lim, director at the Trade and Environment Division at the World Trade Organization. And coming to us from Washington, D.C., Kelly Milton, assistant USTR for Environment and Natural Resources, and my good friend Sarah Stewart, executive director of Silverado Policy Accelerator, who sponsors WITC's ongoing Trade and Environment series. We're delighted to have the opportunity to bring you all together virtually, ask you to turn on your cameras for our 2021 International Trade Conference. Of course, we're coming to you from around the world, so we're also limiting our own carbon footprint today. As I mentioned, this issue is of vital importance to all of us wherever we are in the world, and we're excited to hear your thoughts. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Ken. We are delighted to be participating in the Trade and Environment series, and really hats off to WITC for their leadership in bringing together such an esteemed group of professionals. I think you've got a great agenda lined up today on a lot of new pressing trade issues and some old ones that have been persisting for a while. So hopefully we can make some headway. So today's panel is really focused on the intersection of trade, environment, and climate. You can't open the news today without seeing how climate change is impacting our world in every way. I was looking just at some of the headlines in the news today. Climate change supercharging Northeast snowstorms. Olympians worry that winter disappears from winter games. Technology innovation must be deployed at scale to address climate change today. And one of the things that caught my attention the most was climate change will make coffee more expensive. So one of our most important levers to drive environmental and climate outcomes is trade and trade policy. And yet the work in this space is woefully behind. So I want to take a minute to have each of our panelists provide just some initial remarks on what is the importance of trade as a policy lever for addressing climate change? What are some of the key challenges and opportunities? And from there, we're going to dive in on some specific questions. Ambassador Abraham, can we start with you?
Yes, Sarah, and thank you. And greetings to all participants and fellow panelists. I want to thank WITC for this invitation, and I'm happy to participate in my national capacity as a permanent representative of Costa Rica to the WTO and as a co-coordinator of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, or TESSD, is this year. Some initial thoughts on our question from the Costa Rican perspective. Costa Rica is a small economy, highly integrated in global markets, that pursues economic development on a sustainable and inclusive manner. We firmly believe that economic growth and sustainability go hand in hand, and so economic and environmental policies must be aligned. This alignment between trade and the environment is a state policy matter for Costa Rica. It is expected that the trade agenda will support our decarbonization agenda and in turn the opportunities brought about by decarbonizing our economy will spill over the other dimensions of well-being and the economy, such as trade, innovation, productivity, and competitiveness. In this line, we have proven that environmental conservation and economic growth are intertwined and expect to continue being as a showcase in this positive interaction. And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lim, can we go to you next? I think that we can't hear you.
I'm sorry about that.
There you go. Great.
Yeah, no, great to be with you. I think Ambassador Peralta has really laid out the very exciting initiatives that we're having at the WTO, and particularly TESSD, or structured discussions, as well as there are two others, one which is on plastics and another on fossil fuel subsidy reform. As she said, this is like gravitating towards a convergence of more members, looking at how they can address in a much more positive way the interaction between trade and environment, capturing the whole scope of environmental challenges that we face today, from the climate to problems of resources, to the concerns of biodiversity and so forth. So, as a really introductory comment, I think we're in a sort of new phase, or hopefully a new phase, of a WTO discussion on trade and environment.
I hope so too. And last but not least, my good friend and former colleague, Kelly Milton.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you also to Ken and to WITA for inviting me to participate on this important panel. I did just want to say, I think, Ken, as you noted at the start, taking action and pursuing policies that protect the environment and tackle the climate change crisis is a core pillar of the Biden-Harris administration's agenda. And so, we consider trade policies and environmental policies to be mutually supportive. In order for us to ensure that that is the case, we have to think about how best to use trade tools to protect and conserve our environment. And so the United States pursues this in a variety of ways, such as pressing our trading partners to fully implement the environmental commitments that they've signed up to in our trade agreements, as well as pursuing new, robust, enforceable commitments on a range of trade-related environmental issues, whether this is in multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral engagements. I think this is something that Ambassador Peralta also noted, but the environment is the foundation for a healthy and functioning economy. And this is an interdependency that simply cannot be overlooked. And it's why we believe that environment must be at the core of what we do on trade. It's not a side issue that we consider after, we've considered commercial issues. It's at the core of what we do. Strong environmental rules and provisions in our trade agreements is just as important as, for instance, good rules on services and investment. So just to say that I'm pleased to be here today to talk with you all about the role that we see for trade policy in meeting both, environmental and climate change objectives. Thanks.
Kelly, I think that's a great segue to my first question. And I'm going to start with the ambassador. You're breaking new ground on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability. It's otherwise known as the ACCTS, another trade acronym that we all now need to remember. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what is the ACCTS? What are the key elements? What's the status of the negotiations? And do you anticipate that this will be a blueprint for others to adopt, either by joining the ACCTS or coming up with their own version of it?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, Costa Rica, as you know, is a small country with great ambition for achieving green growth. We aim at boosting economic growth through decarbonization and our economy and investing in the sustainable use of our natural resources, following a people, planet, prosperity approach. This vision led us to launching and co-sponsoring ACCTS negotiations. The ACCTS aims at tackling climate change by negotiation innovative trade disciplines. ACCTS negotiations focus on fostering environment-friendly trade. In fact, ACCTS does not intend to have a punishment approach setting trade retaliation mechanism, but rather to take advantage of innovative trade disciplines to support environmental objectives. This is the shared vision of the 6, as you know, like-minded countries. There are New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Switzerland, and Norway, currently participating in the negotiation of this Trailblazer Agreement. ACCTS encompasses 4 main pillars. 1, liberalizing trade on environmental goods, thus promoting participation on green GVCs and domestic consumption of sustainable products. 2nd, liberalizing trade on environmental services, including those related with decarbonization by making them more available for supporting the technological deployment required to tackle climate change. 3rd, promoting international harmonization of guidelines and good practice of eco-labeling with the aims to support more informed sustainability-enhancing consumption choices and promote sustainable production and trade. And 4th, setting commitments on phasing out harmful fossil fuel subsidies, thus leveling the playing field for clean energy production and consumption, and creating the right set of incentives for innovation in areas such as hydrogen and other clean energies. ACCTS negotiations are currently underway on new rounds of negotiations are expected to take place throughout 2022. Participating countries share to aim to conclude the process as soon as feasible. Any expression of interest to join the negotiations will be given due consideration if it conforms with the level of ambition of participating countries. Moreover, we hope for many WTO members joining the agreement once it is enforced. We decide to lead by example, hoping that the outcome of these negotiations will shed light for other multilateral negotiations. We believe that ACCTS is a step forward in the developing innovative trade disciplines that will enhance other multilateral or regional efforts. Multilateral trade policy is a valid option to tackle climate change and scale up green supply chains. And that is why we are working with like-minded countries and relevant stakeholders to promote a robust work program on the TESSD and in the CTE at the WTO. We envision TESSD as a platform for public-private cooperation and a lever for multilateral trade action in supporting the global environmental agenda. Thanks, Sarah.
Well, I applaud you for your leadership on bringing these issues to the forefront. And I think we're gonna spend some time digging in on a few of the elements of ACCTS and how those are tied in with the work of the TESSD and the CTE. So thank you. Kelly, I want to turn to you because climate change has not featured explicitly in any past US FTA. Albeit there's a number of related provisions tied to combating illegal logging, improving air quality, stemming deforestation, harmonizing energy performance standards. So it's not that there hasn't been an impact, it just hasn't, the words haven't been there. So now under the Biden administration, there's been some really encouraging news from the global arrangement. And I think the OECD Secretary General touched on this as well in one of the questions. I'd love to hear from you. This is a first of its kind arrangement that will ideally deal with some of the carbon that is associated with steel and aluminum production. Can you elaborate on this a little bit further?
Sure, and thanks, Sarah. I mean, before turning to that question specifically, I did want to just pick up a little bit on what you noted at the start, which is the fact that, we do indeed have a number of provisions in our past trade agreements that have an indirect link to tackling climate change. And so, this is through commitments that we have around sustainable forest management, sustainable fisheries management, combating IUU fishing, tackling things like marine debris, improving air quality. So it runs the gamut, as you say, kind of an indirect or kind of implicit effect on climate change impacts. And I did just want to say that, we certainly intend to go further in future agreements, whatever the form, and would aim to also incorporate provisions directly related to improving climate ambition of our trading partners. And, for instance, pursuing net zero goals or preventing carbon leakage. But to your question regarding the recent global arrangement with the European Union on steel and aluminum that was announced late last year, this agreement will, in our view, allow us to combat climate change and address environmentally harmful non-market practices. We expect it will be a win-win for workers and industries and communities on both sides of the Atlantic. It is really still in the early stages, so not much I can say other than to highlight the fact that, the plan for this arrangement will be to discourage trade in high carbon steel and aluminum that contributes to global non-market excess capacity, and ensure that domestic policies support reducing emissions in those carbon intensive sectors. I do believe that it is an example of how like-minded partners can come together to use trade policy to confront the threats of climate change. So we have a lot of hope for this new global arrangement. And then, sorry, one final thing. I did want to also flag that, associated with our trade agreements, we pursue a lot of cooperative work with our trading partners to combat climate change through trade. This is done through a variety of ways, whether it's working with trading partners to enhance use of marine protected areas, to advance climate resilience and mitigation, exchanging best practices on how to build resilience into fisheries resources, or best practices in the area of promoting cleaner production practices and whatnot. So lots of work in that space as well. Thanks.
That's a great point, Kelly. And even in my own experience, some of those cooperative programs supporting implementation are really key. And it's great to hear how you are thinking about kind of modernizing the approach on climate and trade. So, Mr. Lim, I want to go to you next. The TESSD initiative at the WTO has been, I think, a really welcome development. At the end of last year, even though the ministerial conference was postponed, there were 3 environmental declarations that were finalized by ministers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why we saw progress there versus other areas. And is it because there's a growing sense of collective urgency that the WTO needs to accelerate its work in these areas? So if you could talk a little bit about that and what you see on the horizon for some of those work streams, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. I think you're right that, this was really exciting. And also it was, a step taken by the members, despite the postponement of MC12, to show that their commitment going forward to really come towards seeking greater ambition on environmental sustainability. Environmental protection, sustainable development is already enshrined in the WTO through the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement. But I think last year what we saw was a lot more motivation towards really making that preamble to be something that is much more significant in the work of WTO and as well as in trade policy more generally. And I think last year, as all of you know, was a very special year for the environment. We had COP26 in Glasgow as a major point of the year. And the launch of the 3 ministerial initiatives came directly after COP26. And I'm sure that there was a lot of, if you like, expectation as well on the WTO to show what WTO members could do in support of climate change. That's, of course, one dimension. Environmental issues go beyond the climate change issues. As I said, there were also issues concerning resources, biodiversity, the oceans at large. As many of you know, we have an ongoing fishery subsidies negotiations. Of course, that's put in a different track from the 3 ministerial statements that we're talking about. But last year was really a very intense year on that relationship between environment and trade. And I think members wanted to show that despite the postponement of MC12, that they wanted to move ahead and make use of that momentum. So in that sense, I think what we saw last year was both a significant move as well as a sign that there's growing consensus. It's not everyone right now, but there is a growing consensus to act on environmental issues and for the WTO to show that trade can contribute and contribute in a very positive way.
I'd like to ask the ambassador and Kelly to also provide any thoughts that you have on these 3 ministerial declarations and how you see the work programs evolving. I know that 2 of the areas that I'd like to dig into a little bit, one involves the work on environmental goods and those discussions, and the other is on circular economy. So to the extent that you can kind of talk broadly and about any particular priorities that you're looking at from the Costa Rican and United States perspectives, that would be great. Ambassador, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, Costa Rica firmly believes that environmental trade liberalization is a powerful tool for global market integration, since scale economies might advance resource efficiency, green technology, deployment, and economic growth. And it's important to recall, regarding ACCTS negotiations on environmental goods, Costa Rica and most of the ACCTS negotiation parties were actively involved in the IGA negotiations. In the environmental goods group, participants have drawn on the extensive environmental goods discussion and resources from other fora, including the APEC and IGA co-chair list. Indeed, EJA and APEC developments serve as a guiding reference in the environmental goods nomination process of the ACCTS negotiation. I think it's important to remember that kind of things that we have on the agenda.
Shall I jump in? Okay.
Yeah, Kelly, it'd be great.
Sure. Okay, thanks. I'd like to just take a minute to talk, or just to speak a little bit more about kind of how we broadly see the work at the WTO in this space. And so I think, what I wanted to say here is that, we see the United States sees a real opportunity to advance discussions this year in the WTO on trade and climate change related issues. And explore how trade measures, can be utilized, as well as discuss what members actually consider to be clean or climate friendly technologies, goods, and services. One thing I wanted to note in particular about the TESSD, which the United States did formally join at the end of last year, and we signed on to that ministerial statement. We are hoping that the discussions in the TESSD can be somewhat of an incubator of ideas that can get members to speak openly and directly, frankly, about these issues, and might, for instance, help us to think about ways to address the embedded carbon emissions throughout the trading system, or deepen our understanding of what we can accomplish through trade measures and other trade-related interventions. We also, and this I think is particularly important, need to find a way to ensure that trade concerns aren't used to prevent or dissuade legitimate attempts to address climate change, right? So, we want to be able to have these conversations. We want to make sure that we're not having a situation where we're kind of taking aim at each other, when we're trying to address legitimate climate concerns. And so we think that a forum such as the TESSD, the CTE, other opportunities in the WTO can provide us a way to have those important conversations. Thanks.
No, that's a great perspective, Kelly. I wanted to follow up on one thing that you said and maybe ask Ambassador Peralta her views on this. One of the ministerial declarations talks about progressing on work on an environmental goods list, or at least a discussion of what is an environmental good or environmental technology. This is obviously a work stream that's also part of the ACCTS, as we've heard. How is Costa Rica looking at this differently than you may have in the past? Is there a need to look at a different type of definition of environmental goods than maybe was the case during the EGA negotiations, which that list hasn't been updated in some time, or even the APEC list before that? Should we be thinking about a definition of environmental goods that is tied to how trade could facilitate an environmental outcome? And what I mean by that is, if liberalizing trade would actually result in more countries wanting to buy that technology and to use that technology. So I'd be interested in any thoughts that you have on that, specifically and kind of more broadly as part of these exercises that you're involved in two different fora.
Yes, Sarah. Well, we ambition to agree a robust list of environmental goods in our ACCTS agenda negotiation, but also, as you know, in the TESSD, we have trade and the goods also as a priority for members. We ambition to agree a robust list. In doing so, the nomination process results in a long list comprising more than 550 goods in the ACCTS list, whose likelihood to being part of the final list of environmental goods will depend on achieving consensus among the participating countries regarding their identifiable and sound environmental end use or benefit. As this is work in progress, I'm afraid we cannot provide further details at this point. What I can say is that this negotiation has followed a pragmatic approach in light of which environmental goods will be those encompassed in this agreed list. This is to say that undertaking the burdensome task of creating a definition of what is an environmental good is not an objective of ACCTS negotiations. Nevertheless, we have engaged in extensive discussions with our environment and customs authorities to make sure our judgment on each of nominated goods attempt to be as accurate as possible. Ultimately, our aim is that tariff removal for the agreed list of environmental goods will increase to green technologies, promote their use, and substantially reduce the impact of human activity on the environment.
Thank you for your candor. I want to turn now to the issue of circular economy, and I'm going to ask you, Mr. Lim, if you can talk a little bit about this issue. This is coming up in a couple of different places. It's in 2 of the ministerial declarations, I believe. I'd like to have you elaborate a little bit further. How will the work at the WTO include a focus on trade facilitation for, reverse supply chains, or, facilitating trade in recyclable materials? It seems that one of the threshold areas that is likely to be both challenging and potentially controversial could be clarifying definitions and classifications between waste streams and recyclable materials. So I'd appreciate any views from you on where you see opportunities and challenges in the coming year.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think, circular economy is one of these subjects that actually sort of progressed very quickly in the WTO, if I can say, from when the concept first came to a CTE meeting to, as you say now, I think it was in the space of just about 2.5 years. And very quickly, we see this uptake of the idea of circularity. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of the discussion about circular economy, from what I can see, is really taking root in the private sector. Lots of companies, lots of new business models talk about circularity. And in a sense, they are pushing this agenda forward. They see value in circularity. And the question that is then raised, as you have said, is what type of policy framework can help to scale up circularity? And in this type of policy framework, of course, trade and trade policy becomes a key enabler, because the question of circularity is also linked to the question of value chains and global value chains, with a big difference, which is that we're used to thinking about value chains in a very linear way, from making, going to the consumer, and thereafter maybe some of it gets recycled, but a vast amount of it doesn't get recycled. And so you're absolutely right. So to make circularity work, we need to think about the reverse part of circularity, the so-called reverse value chain or supply chain. How do we recover and recuperate materials from products that have reached at least the first end of their first cycle of life, but they could come back into the production process again? So back to where can WTO help, or what can WTO do to help? I think one is certainly on the understanding of what circular economy is and how does that translate into trade policy. We've been having that discussion both in the TESSD as well as in the CTE, and in a range of events sponsored by members around both of these bodies. Going a bit deeper into issues, as you said, of classification, and that's really one of the most challenging ones, I would say, because circular economy is there as a concept. A lot of the classifications are not necessarily, if you like, synchronized to this notion of circularity, particularly how to deal with waste, or if we call it secondary resource materials, which is more progressive from a circularity point of view. And so therefore that means, I think, not just the WTO, of course, it means WTO, it means World Customs Organizations, it means standards bodies, it means as well the private sector. And here TESSD, again, as you've heard from both Ambassador Peralta and Kelly Milton, is quite unique because it can bring different stakeholders together, not just governments. And I think that conversation through TESSD can be really enriching to try to understand better what are the bottlenecks in reverse supply chains? What could trade policy do for the transboundary movement of materials or secondary products? And then there's the added question about actually environmental goods, I would say. I mean, we hear an increasing discussion about how do environmental goods and services in a way supportive of the circular economy, and what types of goods and services could be considered in this sort of context. So I think that's another very important work stream, I think, to work on. And again, WTO does have a lot of data. We also have a lot of notifications. Our environmental database studies all the notifications made to WTO and looks at the objectives behind these notifications. And we find increasingly more and more notifications which are linked to circularity and circular economy, a chance again to learn from these practices and measures. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like you're going to have a very busy year coming up. And I'm going to put one more item on the agenda. And that's this concept of a multilateral carbon regime or a carbon pricing regime. And, you know, we heard from the OECD Secretary General this morning about his thoughts on that and the role that the OECD might play there. I'd like to think through, how do you see the role of the WTO working when we're talking about a global carbon pricing scheme? You know, my own view, I feel like coming to consensus on that is not going to be something that we're going to see anytime soon. I think it's going to be quite the negotiation if it ever gets to that point. I'm not saying that I wouldn't want to see an outcome, but just that I think that the journey to get there is going to be quite difficult. So I'd be interested to hear from you, Mr. Lim, how can the WTO sort of facilitate that discussion? And then how might you also be thinking about managing some of the trade issues and challenges that come up as countries who don't want to wait for a multilateral solution are starting to take their own measures, and how that's going to play out? I feel like this is an area where we're going to look back in a few years and think, wow, we should have been more prepared. So how do we get there?
Well, that's a very easy question, Sarah. I think, I think in the WTO, certainly has an important role here. I mean, at the heart of what WTO is about is building international cooperation. And one can look at any issue, any trade and environment issue. It's about how do you build that international cooperation? As you say, it doesn't happen overnight, but that process of building international cooperation is one that requires transparency, it requires dialogue, it requires evidence-based work, it requires actually an understanding and knowledge of what other partners are doing. I mean, as you mentioned, some are thinking already and some have already been very advanced on the measures that they want to put in place. And again, WTO was created and is there to serve these functions. I mentioned earlier on about notifications, for example. It's not the only thing, but just as an example. The bodies that we have, the Committee on Trade and Environment, and now the structured discussions that have emerged on trade and environmental sustainability. These are all forums to do all of these things, to have that dialogue, to have, as I think Kelly said earlier, a real discussion on these challenges, as well as opportunities. And again, back to what is WTO about, we want to build that cooperation. We want to avoid trade disputes. I mean, people think of WTO as disputes, but actually there are quite a few steps there before one gets to a dispute. And the more that we can do to avoid the disputes, find ways to generate more understanding. That I think is a really key function. There's also a function at a more technical level of the Secretariat and other international secretariats about how we can help members as they deal with this discussion. A lot of this is already happening. I mean, WTO is already working with the IMF, with the OECD, looking at, what does it mean, a global carbon price? And this is about more technical discussions. And my Director General has spoken about this on several occasions, about the need for the international community and international organizations to work in a more coherent way to avoid fragmentation. There are very complex technical issues behind carbon pricing, and getting to grips with this is really important. Some of this discussion is already started, if I can say. We have had various presentations at TESSD about carbon pricing, border carbon adjustments, some of the tricky issues, as you've said, between these types of measures and the WTO regime. No conclusions, not saying that it is this or that, but simply understanding the framework that we're working in, I think has been very, very helpful. Some of it has been in the Committee on Trade and Environment, with members intending to take on board border carbon adjustments, explaining what these things are, why are they doing it, and how are they seeking to minimize the trade concerns that could arise. So I think we have different entry points to the discussion. And I think a lot could be done. I understand what you're saying about the difficulty of getting towards multilateral negotiations. But a negotiation, as all of you know and know better than me, because many of you are negotiators, it is in itself an ecosystem. It's not just one thing. It's how the different parts come together. And WTO has, of course, has the benefit of being a multilateral institution. So we can span a vast range of views, from developed to developing and in between, or to the very least developed. And to build the international cooperation, everybody has to be a part of the conversation. So these are some of the things, some of the elements which I think WTO is well placed to contribute. Thank you.
Well, it's a robust agenda. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left and we have a few questions. I'm not sure we'll get through all of them, but I'll make sure to work with Ken and Diego that the panelists can see what the questions are. Maybe I'll start with one, and this will give an opportunity for Kelly and Ambassador Abraham to weigh in on the carbon price issue. So the question is, can we have a border carbon adjustment unless or until everyone has a price on carbon? So Kelly, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Ambassador Abraham, and if we're able, we'll take another question before we wrap up.
Sure, I can start and I'll try to be brief because, as you say, we're short on time. I mean, basically, I think one way I'd like to think about this is the fact that, in terms of trade-based approaches to addressing the issue of carbon leakage, which is what a border adjustment aims to do. I mean, something like a border adjustment is, in our view, an opening bid, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the final answer or the only answer when it comes to seeking a trade-oriented climate solution. I think it's important to note that we all have, in fact, different domestic approaches in some ways, but that they can also achieve the same objective. And so that needs to really be considered when we think about how best to design or, incorporate something like a border adjustment. To successfully address climate change, it just simply cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. And what's important is figuring out how trading partners can come together and agree, or at a minimum align on the shared objective and action that's needed to decarbonize economies and work together in that way. So I think that's just something that I would note in that regard. Thanks.
Ambassador Abraham, why don't you have the last word here before we turn back to Ken for the next panel, and just my sincere gratitude to all of you for your insights today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And well, this is an issue that has equally attract interest and questions from the members in these matters that we had. In TESSD, we have listened to this call and are ready to facilitate the space for exchanges between the different sides, maintaining the trade and environmental dimensions at the core. We foresee that this topic will be part of our agenda for the year as well, and hope that our platform allows for frank and candid discussion that can bring clarity to all parties. And thank you for this opportunity, Sarah, to share with you our thoughts.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you very much. Incredibly grateful to you, Ambassador Abraham. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Holim, pleasure to have had you back again. Thank you for your time. We know it's getting late in Geneva, so really appreciate that.